welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's Bad Ideas episode is brought to you by our featured patron, Globula.
Globin.
Thanks, Globs. Today we're going to be talking about the Aral Sea, and how it turned from the fourth largest lake in the world to one of the biggest ecological disasters that I've ever heard of.
We've covered some big ones here, too.
Yeah, I don't want to oversell this because I don't have specific numbers on how this compares to other giant ecological disasters. This one's definitely worse than the Love Canal, though. The Aral Sea is nestled between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. At one point, it was a huge saltwater lake covering 26,000 miles, which means that it was just slightly larger than the state of West Virginia.
Wow.
Yes. And it supplied the surrounding regions with plentiful fish, and for a while in the 1800s it was home to a Russian naval base. Despite the fact that it was landlocked so they couldn't get out, it was important enough strategically that they had ships stationed in the lake to be able to conduct missions along its shores.
I'm wondering if there are any other lakes with that sort of distinction.
Probably the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea?
That would make sense. It'd have to be like full-on seas.
Yes. Speaking of the Caspian Sea, it's another example of what this Aral Sea is, which is what they call a terminal lake. A terminal lake is a body of water which has water flowing into it, but no water flowing out of it. These kinds of bodies of waters typically show up in deserts, and they're often very salty. The most egregious example of this is the Dead Sea, which is super, super, super salty and nothing can live in it. But generally how this works is rivers flow into a basin, they're leaching salt from the rocks around them, and when the water gets to this basin, because it's a desert, it evaporates faster than the basin can fill, and so it never rises to a point where it seeks another outlet to the ocean. But because the Aral Sea is in a desert, the rivers that feed it are very valuable to the people in the area as a source of irrigation. If you want to grow anything, you can't pump water out of the Aral Sea because it's salty and, pumping takes a lot of energy, but you can take water from the rivers around it and water your farm fields with that. And for a reasonable amount of time before this story takes place, people had been doing some irrigation from the rivers that feed the Aral Sea. But it got a lot worse in the 1940s because of communism.
Surprise, surprise. The episode that's such a bad idea, we're too afraid to do an entire episode on it.
I like to be more specific, Tony, because at least there you can back up your bad ideas with facts rather than things that people might dispute. And this whole thing comes about because Joseph Stalin, intent on turning the Soviet Union into a major world power, developed a plan to turn the desert region into a fertile farmland by diverting the Aral Sea's two tributaries into a massive system of irrigation canals that could water huge regions of farmland. It was part of what was called the Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature, and this was something they came up with after a major drought caused massive deaths in the area. There was also probably some major mismanagement of the area caused by the centralized planning government, where they took the food that the farmers were growing and shipped it off to other places, leaving the people who were growing the food to starve to death. It is a real bad situation. We're not going to go down that particular rabbit hole, though. We're just talking about the ecological side of things.
Yeah, and if you look at that one, that's one where, even if you were going and gleaning extra pieces of corn from the road, they could put you in a gulag for that.
Or kill you.
Yeah.
The canal project continued through the 1950s, diverting more and more water from the Aral Sea. However, these canals were often very inefficient. The basic idea of a canal is that you have a big ditch and the water flows through it and it gets to the place you want to water and goes out into the fields and waters your crops. But because this is in such an arid area, you have to account for evaporation when you're building these canals, and they didn't. They didn't build covered canals because probably they were trying to save money, and they also didn't line the canals that they were building very well, so you're losing a lot of water to evaporation, and you're having water seep into the ground before it ever gets to the fields that you're actually trying to water, which means that the water you are diverting is actually being used incredibly inefficiently.
So instead of like making concrete canals that would keep it from seeping, they just did dirt and it got sucked out.
In many cases, not universally, but a large percentage of these canals were not well constructed. As the canal project continued into the 60s, the Aral Sea started to shrink. And it became apparent that if they continued down this course of action, it would eventually basically disappear. But at the time, people thought it was an acceptable loss. They said, listen, it's a big saltwater sea, and yeah, we're getting some fish out of it, but if we can turn this into a big cropland where we can grow lots and lots of cotton, which was eventually what they did decide to grow here, the area around the Aral Sea turned into a giant cotton monoculture where all they grew was cotton.
I would have thought they were worried more about food than clothing at this point.
Well, it was, again, part of this whole centralized planning thing. The idea was the Soviet Union would be able to sell the cotton and then use the money to buy food and maybe eventually send that food back to where the farmers were. Interestingly enough, this plan did sort of work. In 1988, the fields that were watered by this Aral Sea canal system produced more cotton than any other nation in the world. They were producing so much cotton that the price essentially fell to the point where it wasn't useful to continue producing cotton, but because it was a centralized planned economy, they had to keep producing cotton, and people were losing a lot of money, and the economy went into a tailspin.
Yeah, that's the whole 4-year plan thing where you just keep doing it no matter what.
I think it's 5-year plans, but yes. It's worth noting, by the way, that even though the Soviet Union is gone, this area still operates under a government top-down mandate to produce cotton as a monoculture, and there is what people would call slave labor used in the area. People have to produce cotton. It's not an option. So this area is just kind of screwed in all kinds of ways, and it's about to get worse as the Aral Sea continues to shrink. What people in the area didn't anticipate was that as the Aral Sea continued to recede, it would become much more salty. And at a certain point, water can become so salty that even saltwater fish can't exist in it. As we mentioned earlier, the Dead Sea is dead because it's so high in its salt levels, and the Aral Sea had this happen. It increased tenfold and then 30-fold in the percentage of the salt in the water, because what happens is the water evaporates because it's not being replenished by the rivers, but the salt doesn't evaporate, so it's still there in higher and higher concentrations as the Aral Sea shrinks, killing off all the fish that could have survived in the ever smaller lake. And that's not all. In addition to the lake itself becoming more salty, the land that it left behind was also saturated with salt.
So it was no longer useful for farmland in the areas that it vacated.
It was not. Now, you might say, well, at least the areas that were useful for farmland before are still okay, but they weren't, because the desert winds that had once been tempered by the lake's presence picked up the salt in frequent dust storms and spread it across the farmlands that had once benefited from the irrigation that had drained the body of water in the first place, making the land around the lake essentially barren. The salt left behind coated plants that grew up from what was once the lake bed, contaminating the animals that ate them. They got something called salt sickness, which I heard one guy say made his camel essentially slam its head into the ground until it killed itself. So
That is pretty intense. That's like mad cow levels.
yes. There are also claims that runoff pesticides from the farming and toxic chemicals from Soviet weapons testing exacerbated the problems even further. I wasn't able to find enough sources to say for sure that this actually was part of the problem. It's something that people claim, but I'm trying to stick with things that I have really solid evidence for, Tony. Regardless, eventually the mighty lake, once the 4th largest in the world, was so diminished that it split into 2 bodies of water, the northern and southern Aral Seas. The humans that live around this area have experienced a variety of health problems because of the collapse of the Aral Sea. Tuberculosis, cancer, and a laundry list of other assorted diseases common in the area can all be traced back to the collapse of the Aral Sea ecosystem. The child fatality rate is 75 out of 1,000 newborns, and 12 out of every 1,000 women die in childbirth. It's just crazy to go and look at this. You can see videos of this area, and it's this wide open, flat expanse with these weird, tiny little plants that have somehow managed to survive in the salt, and then huge hulks of ships that once sailed this massive sea, now just sitting on the land with no water in sight, rusting to death.
Yeah, I'm looking at pictures of it now, and it's just like you would never expect to see these sort of ships beached. Like it looks like something out of a post-apocalypse movie.
It really does. It reminds me of something like Mad Max, not quite to that level of desertification because there's some plants around there, but it's just this wasteland. And one of the videos I watched, a woman described that when she was a little girl, she used to be able to swim in the water at the beach of this town that is now tens, if not hundreds of miles from the waterfront. It's just a massive disaster on so many levels. Everything about this region has changed because of this massive undertaking to reroute this river without properly understanding the consequences of what this would cause.
And is there any chance that they could actually allow these rivers to fill the sea back? Or is it completely, like, would that just not really do anything? Like, or is there too much agriculture?
There have been some projects toward that end. There was a dam that was built that was supposed to help rejuvenate the northern Aral Sea. It at least lowered the salinity of the water so that fish could survive, and the sea expanded somewhat. But you have to remember that this is a collapse that has been happening at least since the 1940s. So if it took 50 years to get to this point, it's probably going to take at least 50 years to get back to the point where it was. And there's the question of whether you're going to be able to convince people to give up all their irrigation for their farms, which seems unlikely in this kind of an area.
Yeah, definitely not.
Despite the fact that I'm not much of an environmentalist, even I can see here that the bad idea was this huge project that uprooted everything that had been known about this ecosystem beforehand, and the lack of respect for what the lake had brought to the area, the misunderstanding of what would happen if this lake dropped in its levels, or the lack of care about the people who were living along the shores that would eventually become just a wasteland, really all work together to create a massive ecological disaster that has human effects as well as environmental effects. Nobody comes out on the good end of this, ultimately, because the devastation here is so widespread and so bad that it's not worth the temporary gains that you got from irrigating these cotton fields for a while.
Yeah, and if they would have used better practices, they might have been able to save some of this and make it so they were only taking half as much water.
There is value in irrigation. Let's not go on the opposite end of the spectrum, but you have to be wise about how you're implementing these programs, and this is not an example of wisdom in implementing environmental changes.
Yeah, environmental impact studies don't seem to be a part of the Soviet culture.
Which is weird, because the kind of people today that you would think are all about socialism are very much about the environment.
Yeah, generally.
But Stalin was like, nah, this isn't my way. Get all this stupid environment out of the way. We're going to do it. We know better. The people. Screw Mother Nature. She's part of the bourgeoisie. That's our commentary on communism.
One of many that will be on the show over time.
Well, only as they relate to specific bad ideas, Tony.
True. We did the Great
Leap Forward?
Yeah, the Great Leap Forward.
Yes, that was actually a couple of bad ideas all rolled into one that definitely hurt a lot of people. But this one was a little bit more focused. I really enjoyed studying this. I hope that the people around this area can figure out a way to get this back working. I hope they can find more freedom, because that seems to be a big problem for them. They just got electricity in 2009, so kind of a crummy place to live. I don't know that it's all because of the Aral Sea project, but I can't imagine that helps at all.
Yeah.
That'll do it for this week, guys. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this, don't forget to tell a friend about it. Subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you prefer, or you can get us over on YouTube at our Bad Ideas channel. And if you really love us, you can help support the show over at patreon.com/humanechoes. We'll see you guys next week.
Bye.